There's been a lot going on this week, but one of the things that I think that I should have spent more time on was the president's announcement about new vaccine regulations. Yes, I talked about it in the Tuesday episode, but I can only say so much about it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not trained in this stuff. I can only do so much research. But I thought I needed to get an expert on the show to talk about what it actually means to have the president say what he's saying about vaccines, about wanting to split up vaccines, what it means for us to have fewer vaccinated people in America, and what it means for our kids, for our infants, for our pregnant parents, and what it means for the project of the president and his administration moving away from small d democracy and towards something that looks an awful lot like authoritarianism, which is something that I've talked a lot about here on the show. It's why my guest today is, once again, Dr. Scott Greer from the University of Michigan, a public health expert, as well as comparative politics expert, and understands how this stuff works and where health and politics meet. We have an excellent conversation, which is the same thing as every time he's on the show, but this time it's about what these vaccines actually look like and what it'll look like when they're not around, what these diseases look like, what they used to look like, because most of us don't really remember what happens when you get rubella or the mumps and what it means to have a measles outbreak right now. And then we also do talk about what it means to have health as a wedge issue that's dividing Americans, even though doctors, public health officials, and experts across the country desperately want this to be something that binds us instead of tears us apart, especially with the midterms not far away and, more importantly, school right around the corner. This decision to announce this new vaccine recommendation to both Scott and I sounded a little odd to time it right now, so I thought this was a good time to have him on the show to talk about these things. It's Friday, August 14th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. Before we get into today's show, this is the final week of the Make It Make Sense anniversary sale for the Make It Make Sense Substack. If you haven't done it yet, you've got just a few days left to lock in the launch price of $5 a month or $50 a year. That gets you access to the entire podcast history, the weekly original reporting, things you forgot from civics class, too long tuned out, and the occasional Make It Make Nonsense, which is basically something in your inbox 6 days a week, if not every single day of the week. Now, that sale runs until August 20th. You can head to makeitmakesense.substack.com or head to the link in the description for this episode to get that deal right now. Okay, let's get back to the show. Well, Dr. Scott Greer, thank you for coming back on the show. You're kind of like the unofficial chief medical correspondent for Make It Make Sense here. Also fresh off a transatlantic flight, so I think I have you until you keel over or something. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk about this set of vaccine recommendations. And I talked a little bit about this stuff earlier this week on the show, but I can only say so much, not having the background you do. When you heard that these were the recommendations that were going to be coming out of the White House, what were your initial thoughts about the diseases that we no longer feel necessary to protect kids and, I guess, ourselves against?
I wish I were shocked.
Yeah.
So the top line is, in many ways, nothing has changed. There's no new research. Nothing has been learned or discovered that justifies any of this. It's old anti-vax talking points. There's no change to what'll happen if you go to a pediatrician tomorrow with a kid. There's been no change to insurance, no change to the payment system, in large part because the health insurance plans and the American Academy of Pediatrics have said that they don't believe in following the whims of RFK Jr. And crucially, there's no new vaccines. There's this strange dreamlike quality to this in which the president has told the country to get vaccines that don't exist. And then there's some weasel words in the executive order about how they really ought to be developed.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, I think, specifically here about the splitting up of the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps, rubella, because those haven't been separate vaccines for decades. And for a pharmaceutical company which I don't know which ones actually make it, I don't know if it's Pfizer or GSK or who it is, but they would need to spend quite a bit of money that's not afforded to them in this executive order, and a lot of time. Like, I think it's like 5 to 10 years to split this up and spin up new vaccines. So what are we even talking about here?
I I I can tell you what Trump appears to be talking about, which is his own particular brand of anti-vax talking points. He was talking about how children are having vats of fluid injected into them, which I guess tells you he didn't accompany his kids to the pediatrician.
Yeah, even though he said he did. He said he was there for all of his kids. And like the idea of Trump sitting in a pediatric waiting room is very funny to me. Like his knees curled up on one of those little chairs is very funny to me. But yeah, he makes it sound like they came in with a paint can of like mixed up vaccines and like pulled in one of those syringes you used to roast a turkey with. Like that's just not what happens at all.
Yeah, and it's kind of the particular Trump twist on it, because there's a whole lot of language about things like too much antigen that sounds scientific but fundamentally doesn't make any sense that you find among anti-vaccination advocates. Whereas this is Trump sort of translates too much antigen into too much liquid, and he went on a bit of a riff about how you need time between shots to deal with all the fluid in the body, as if it were some sort of an IV or drinking too much out of your bottle or something.
Right. And this idea that there's a overloading of the immune system is this thing that people, I think to them it sounds reasonable. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I get the flu shot and I feel a little flu the next day. Like we shouldn't be giving, infants or 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds, maybe 4 or 5 shots in a row. That feels like a lot, but that's not really what's happening here, right?
It's not. And in a sense, plenty of people by now have had a COVID vaccine the same day as a flu vaccine, and you probably feel pretty cruddy the next day, but your immune system has not suffered any damage. That's your immune system deploying the responses that it would have to the real diseases. And overload your immune system. Again, it sounds technical, sounds kind of like engineering, but it doesn't make any sense. And the downsides are impressive, right? So let's pretend that the vaccines existed. Trump comes out with the point that he wants to space the vaccines so you kind of get one vaccine per disease per visit. His quote was, "It's inconvenient, it's 5 stops, but it's something that I think will have a huge impact on autism." He recognizes that it's inconvenient. I mean, 5 trips to the pediatrician with a new kid and jobs, like that's difficult.
Yes. That's why MMR was bundled together, was that it was just like, hey, we don't have to split this up. Yeah. Let's do this all in one go. And that way it's 1 trip to the doctor and not potentially 3. And yeah, I can't imagine, like I'm not a parent myself, but I can't imagine trying to schedule that many trips to the doctor around work and figuring out how that's going to work. And for most people, I think that is untenable.
And
absolutely.
You're multiplying the number of doctor's office visits or pharmacy times 5.
Right.
And the other point that kind of gets forgotten is that if you space them out, this means there's longer time with the kids not having immunity. So if you don't have immunity to one of the diseases in the MMR shot, or you've only had kind of half the dose and we're spacing things out, that's a longer period of time when you go to the play group or the daycare, and the disease can spread. So you're actually increasing the number of kids who aren't immunized at all by doing this.
Which defeats the purpose of having the vaccines at all then.
Yeah, or it's just in the same way that, fewer vaccinated people means more chance of spread. And these are kids who are right on the edge where they're out there with immune systems that are trained against almost nothing. We're trying to get the vaccines into them, but they're very, very, as we call it, epidemiologically naive. Meaning their bodies haven't been exposed to any of this and they don't know the playbook to fight the diseases.
Right. That's a fun phrase. I did not know that was an actual phrase of how we describe that. I like that. I'm going to use that for lots of things that maybe have nothing to.
There's a lot of people who are epidemiologically naive in a different sense.
But like the idea that your body, when you're an infant or a small child, is naive to the diseases it might be bombarded with, around there, is kind of a fascinating concept to me. And that what we're doing here is sort of with vaccines is teaching the body how to recognize what these are, which I think people for a while inherently understood that. I mean, as a kid, when I learned about vaccines, that's what I inherently understood about how vaccines worked. It's just either people have chosen to forget that, or they've scared themselves out of understanding that in a way, because this is all tied back to the RFK Jr., Bhattacharya stuff about vaccines and autism. And we're just going to do this again and again and again, I guess.
It's a fascinating topic, how this happened. I mean, including like the rise in autism, quote unquote. Well, it's because autism used to be an incredibly stringent diagnosis. You had to be really quite far down the spectrum to have any shot at getting a diagnosis of autism. And it was far more stigmatized across society than it is today. And there was all this nonsense about it came about because your mother didn't love you enough. So refrigerator mothers caused autism, and autism were dysfunctional. And we've tried to move away from all of that, right? We've tried to think in terms of neurodivergence because it's not a clear and fast line. And there's a lot of people who get a lot of really good, have great lives, despite having some characteristics associated with autism. And then when you try to do data, it's a more expansive understanding of all the diversity of human brains. You get better data, all right, but you also get recognition of something that was always a fact, which is that some people have a few of the traits that they associate with autism. So you get what they would say is a rapid increase in autism, and then they have to go look for the thing in modern life that has changed. And it's like, well, no, we're diagnosing it better.
Right. The thing in modern life that has changed is us being able to see it better. That's the change. It's not the increase in vaccines. Yeah. And I just don't know why this keeps coming up. I guess it's the same. I likened it in the show earlier this week to like, this is to public health what voter fraud is to what I do for elections. Like this is just the thing that it's not going to go away because there's a certain amount of people who just won't be convinced otherwise because they don't want to be, or they refuse to see some of the stuff or whatever. I do think it's worth talking about too, though, what we're risking by, I don't remember if it was Jay Bhattacharya, if it was RFK Jr., who was in the Oval Office this week when they did this executive order, but who was talking about, we're going to, if we drop down to 80% vaccination rates, that's still 80%, which is a pretty high number. And some of these diseases like, mumps or rubella, are just diseases we don't see anymore because of the vaccines. Measles was like that up until last year and this year. So I guess, one, let's talk about some of these diseases and what they actually look like and what they do. And let's talk about what it means to be at 80% vaccination here, because, that isn't where doctors want that to be.
Yeah. And you can calculate what it takes to have herd immunity. And herd immunity has been a much betrayed phrase.
Yes.
But it basically means that you have such a high vaccination level that someone who's epidemiologically naive is unlikely to encounter it from another member of the herd. Yeah. And you can calculate this based essentially on how infectious the diseases are. So measles is the really frightening one because it has a tremendously high reproduction rate, which is the term for how many people a person with measles on average infects.
Right.
So measles is the scariest one because it's both a really authentically frightening disease, and it also transmits really quickly.
Right.
But there's others that are, less transmissible, but most of them, you can calculate this. If you're below 80%, you don't have herd immunity, right? So our flu vaccination rates run around 50%, and every year we have a meaningful amount of sickness and death attributable to flu. I mean, it's great to be vaccinated against flu because you're less likely to get it and you're less likely to get really sick. But the flu is still clearly circulating, as most of us can testify. And the other point I would make, in a sense, is that we live in an America where any issue pretty rapidly gets polarized into pro and anti. Since we're doing terms of art, the political scientists call it negative polarization. So most issues, once they get real public profiles, start to hover around, 48-52 sorts of close divides. So if you come along and you say that 80% of Americans have taken a costly action, you don't get immunized for fun, right? Needles, doctors' offices. 80% of Americans have done it. That's a political triumph. That's an extraordinary level of national consensus. That's better than we got for our 250th national birthday. It's an epidemiological disaster. 80% herd immunity, 80% immunization against measles means you do have measles circulating. And if you're immune compromised or if you're a baby, you're going to get measles. And I'm happy to talk about why that's a lot more frightening than people remember.
Let's talk about that, because CIDRAP, the epidemiological center out of University of Minnesota, put out a report just this last week that basically was like, we have a runaway train when it comes to the outbreak of measles in this country, and
Yeah.
nobody seems to be doing anything. And then the following week, we get this thing. So let's talk about measles.
Yeah, measles is the scariest because it's really infectious,
Mhm.
right? So if you're naive to measles and you get anywhere near somebody with it, you have a strikingly high chance of getting it.
Yeah.
That's why it's spreading so quickly. And it's not just some red dots and stay home from school.
Right.
I mean, it can be that, but it has all these really, really cunning, evil things. Sort of my favorite for shocking people is something called immune amnesia, which is because of the way the measles virus binds onto your cells, it causes the immune system to forget a whole lot of other diseases. So you get immunity to something, a variety of the common cold, but more important things as well. Measles will cause your body to forget that you have that immunity. It's as if you forget, the immune system will forget a substantial part of the playbook. So once you've had measles, you're more vulnerable to all sorts of other random viruses.
How does that work? Well, I mean,
You want to get a virologist for this one, but basically
Sure.
what the measles does, what the measles virus does, is it causes amnesia in the immune system because the thing that it likes to bind to is shared with a lot of other viruses.
got it.
That's one of the, and then, can cause also effects 10 years down the road. So even if you thought you got away with just sort of some red dots and a rash, you can end up having meaningful negative effects from measles 10 years hence. So we could have a lot of people who push through it right now, and they're going to find out that they're in trouble in 2035.
Right. Which is a much different problem than all of a sudden you sort of have these, it sounds like sort of these leapfrog sort of outbreaks of measles if it's not vaccinated against. I don't think I learned anything about rubella ever growing up because none of us had to worry about it anymore.
Well, paging Tucker Carlson here. It's usually mild. That's the good news.
Sure.
But if it gets into somebody who's pregnant, it is prone to cause birth defects, which are charmingly called congenital rubella syndrome. And this can have effects on heart, brain, cataract. It can cause all sorts of long-term birth defects in kids, and there's a small chance that it can do worse to adults. So the point of rubella vaccines is to try and make sure that there's no chance that somebody who's pregnant gets infected with rubella by creating herd immunity to rubella. And again, notice that we're not going to see a lot of these effects for years at the rate that people have kids.
Right.
Which leaves mumps.
Yeah. Let's talk about mumps. Yeah.
Yeah. And mumps is very painful. There's all sorts of symptoms in addition to kind of big swelling around your neck. And it also has a number of really weird side effects that aren't that common. But one of the most striking ones is essentially testicular inflammation, testicular swelling, which can lead to infertility. That's why I think, Tucker Carlson might be particularly interested in that one. So it's really contagious. It'll knock you out of work for 2 or 3 weeks. You'll be in a lot of pain. And it's risking all sorts of weird inflammatory diseases that can cause lasting damage.
Right.
So do we want these circulating in our society? Do we want birth defects, measles, which is flat out lethal, mumps, which can give you all sorts of incredibly embarrassing inflammatory problems? Or how about one shot, be done with it?
Right.
One shot, be done with it was the choice that we made, the MMR vaccine.
Right. And to me, these are things that we know. Like you said at the very beginning of this conversation, none of the science has changed on this. We didn't learn anything new about these vaccines. We didn't learn anything new about the diseases themselves. So I kept coming back to this in researching this stuff and listening to these guys talk this week, not just at the press conference itself for the executive order signing, but as they've been on the other shows and stuff. I don't understand to what end this is. Some of this stuff feels like it's against the other aims they have, which, in terms of when we're talking about pregnancy or fertility or infertility, that goes against sort of their push to have people have more babies. So there's that part of this. Obviously, it's putting children at risk. So there's that whole end of this. But I don't understand what the end game here is. And can you see it? Because I certainly can't.
Well, I think that part of it is I think one of the ways to think about it is that we have what amounts to a quackery industry in the United States. And it's a big, powerful one. And it goes all the way from sort of people who have a vaguely wrong idea of which supplements are going to boost their immune system and how that all works, through to some really, really frightening stuff. And I think we'd have a better understanding of American politics if we didn't see anti-vaccinationism as just a social movement. Heaven knows there's plenty of people who, because of their life experiences, are essentially part of an anti-vaccination social movement. But there's also real money and there's real profits here. They're in the supplement industry, they're in wellness grifting. I think it's a telling point that when the National Vaccine Information Center, which was kind of the original modern anti-vaccination activism group, got into financial trouble, they were bailed out by the chiropractors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if we think of this as an industry, a self-aware industry, well, who are their enemies? Who really interferes with their business? The FDA, scientists, doctors who are keeping this one secret from you, as you see on the internet every 30 seconds. Public authorities, Dr. Anthony Fauci. These are all people who kind of have, by design, are opposed to the commercial interests of this industry. So there's an avalanche of wellness grifting out there, which creates this kind of oppositional culture. And that industry has taken over its regulators, and we're seeing the effects. So don't think of it so much as kind of a weird marginal social movement that's taken over, as an industry that took over its regulators and it's doing what it wants.
Sure. And that makes sense to me with somebody like, Mehmet Oz in the role that he's in. RFK Jr., I think also falls into that category too. I mean,
a lot of what we would call conflict of interests. If you use that phrase still.
Yes. And like, I also think Jay Bhattacharya is like in that vein as well. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
A lot of the time it's expert witnessing and stuff, which is, enough to buy a professor. We're cheap.
Good. I mean, you're here for free. So yeah, I got that. I want to know how you're feeling about some of this stuff too, because since this is so reoccurring and these kinds of people, this, what we can call it a grift movement, a quasi corporate, maybe / nonprofit ish movement that has made its way to the top echelons of power for public health. How worried are you about the effects of this kind of a thing that we saw this week? And it being an attack on public health and medicine writ large, because it feels like the hole that doctors and public health experts are going to have to climb out of is just getting deeper and deeper.
Yeah. And by and large, it's doctors who actually have the ability to make recommendations that parents listen to. Mm-hmm. And that's wobbly, but they're certainly much more likely to listen to doctors than to, say, any elected politician or media figure.
Sure.
So we're putting more on the backs of the poor pediatricians. And we also know a lot of kids in America, for one reason or another, don't really have a stable, trusted pediatrician in their life, because a lot of Americans don't have stable, trusted primary care in their lives. And with other Republican health policies, that population is going to get a lot bigger suddenly.
Right. And that's part of this whole kind of snowball project thing here too, which again is pushing people away from traditional medicine and traditional ways that we've accessed how we get medical care in this country. I mean, I think you and I are specifically talking about access to things like Medicaid and Medicare, which were absolutely gutted last year by the one big beautiful bill, and the work requirements of those things, removing people from things like SNAP and WIC, and that there lots of touting this week about how SNAP numbers have dropped precipitously, and it's like, well, did you? Are people, working more and now they don't need it? Obviously not. They're just not getting access to the food they need. And now they're more sick and they can't go see a doctor because they don't have the money to go see a doctor, kind of a thing. And if I remember right, we also have a doctor shortage in this country right now too. So there are fewer doctors. We're going to have more sick people. And now they want to spread out the vaccines for people to go get with fewer doctors. So more visits to fewer doctors seems antithetical to this project of keeping people healthy, which is ostensibly what MAHA is doing. The Make America Healthy Again movement is meant to do. I don't know how to circle that square.
I would go back to saying that they're not even going to try, right? We have parties or coalitions, and one part of the party is really, really concerned about reducing access to government support for healthcare through the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid and Obamacare. And another part is on this kind of crusade to remake certain narrow parts of the American healthcare system based on their theories of environmental pollution.
Right.
And it's almost mystical, right? It's about putting things into your body. And it's like, well, guys, over at EPA, they're busy making it very easy for industries to put all sorts of things into our bodies.
Right,
Like,
right.
do you want to talk to each other?
Right. That part of this has also been interesting in that, like, and you were talking about this before we rolled, that like RFK Jr. is this guy that, and I think the MAHA movement in general, even though they don't see themselves this way, the people who are the big spokespeople for this thing, it's this wedge movement between members of this own administration and the Republican Party writ large, or the conservative idea writ large, because it has this thing about it where it has to contain all these things at once and none of them, and you're supposed to just pick and choose. And a lot of these people are having a hard time with that. I think you're getting somewhat of a backlash, and vaccines is just kind of the easiest way to rally them back, into the fold. Politically, that seems a reason to do this thing, knowing that a lot of these things are never going to actually come to fruition.
I think the idea that Trump had, 2 years ago, was that sort of MAHA made just a nice sidecar. Like, it didn't really involve contradicting anything he cares about, because they're not going to really fight him on environmental regulation or something. And the actual problem is that RFK Jr. is like a machine for creating wedge issues, right? A wedge issue is an issue in politics that unites your side and splits the other side. And you want those, right? You want issues where, you as a Republican, you all agree, but Democrats, half of them agree with you, and they're fighting each other, right? What you don't want to do is have a member of your cabinet who comes popping out every so often and saying things that 70% of your party doesn't agree with.
Right. And every time he does, everybody in the party has to be like, oh, okay, here's Bobby. And then we got to do a thing for a week and hope it goes away, or that something else catches the news cycle and we don't have to do that anymore. And that could just be on its own rails for a little while. Which I think is kind of why yesterday or Wednesday, the vice president came out with targeting hospitals for fraud, for doing gender affirming care for kids. Which felt like this is still health related. It's Health Week here at the White House, but like, we're going to just pivot a little bit away from Bobby a little bit and let him do this thing.
And trans issues are a wedge against Democrats typically, right?
Yes.
The number of Republicans who are overtly in favor of trans rights is pretty close to zero.
Yeah.
And Democrats fight each other on the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the good news is that the negative polarization in America is so intense that you would predict over time the Democrats become pretty reliably in favor of trans rights, simply because if Republicans are against it, Democrats who are against it are going to get tired of trying to explain themselves.
Right.
But it's also like, this is a really strange way to go into an election, right? I can kind of understand the Vance thing, because that's still a wedge issue. It still demoralizes Democrats. We can still have nice conversations about the basically non-existent men and women's sports. Mm-hmm. And that still gets people going. Whereas the vaccines, I don't know.
Well, and like, we're going into August. I get this thing happening in maybe the spring, when you don't have kids actively getting their vaccination list from schools.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing. It is odd timing for that. I do kind of want to zoom out a little bit here and talk about this use of public health in our march away from democracy, towards autocracy, authoritarianism, choose your adjective, right? I've used all of them on the show in the last 9 months to a year. Right, exactly. It seems to me that we often, speaking of wedge issues, see, we as Americans writ large, we see public health and medicine as this thing separate, and politics are over here, and not always, but like, never the twain shall meet kind of a thing. But it's not that. They bleed over. Certainly the pandemic does that. But it's really, this is public health being used as a tool in the process of this thing. And I know that you've written about this a little bit. I know that you've thought about this a lot. So, help me understand some of this.
I think one way to think about it is people in public health desperately want to be bipartisan. There's nothing they want more than to be non-political and technical and evidence-based.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of conversation in public health about essentially, what did we do to make them hate us?
Right.
And there's a whole set of talking points if you want to talk about what public health did wrong. And by public health, it's never clear whether you mean a loudmouth on Twitter or a professor or your county public health officer or Anthony Fauci or a hallucination. And the argument is that we were arrogant and too left-wing. So that there was, for example, the American Public Health Association talked about about racism being a public health emergency. And on the other hand, you had sort of this imagined concept in which an all-powerful Anthony Fauci, closed Walmart. And this stuff doesn't make a ton of sense, but a lot of public health people kind of have the sense that the party got too closely identified, public health got too closely identified with the Democratic Party and too woke, and that's caused an understandable backlash. And the solution is to be more apolitical and pay more attention to Republicans. And this argument really falls apart, right? Like, what if Republicans are people with agency who have thought about things and decided that they don't like public health policies for their own reasons? They're not just acted upon by public health. It's not like this is some simple little machine where you poke it and it moves.
Right. Which was what I was thinking when you were saying that. Is like, well, couldn't it just be the exact same thing, that it's the right, it's the Republican Party that actually walked away from public health and towards this grift machine instead of the other way around, when it's actually public health being like, wait, no, where are you going? We need you here too. And all of a sudden they're gone.
And like what people in public health value more than anything is a story about how they managed to get together sort of, Democratic and Republican governors to do a thing that reduced pharmaceutical prices or added some kind of a screening that saved a certain number of newborns' lives.
Yeah.
Like that's what really gets valued.
Yeah.
And it means that there's just this intense desire to go to that world and not recognize that there's things called enemies.
How does public health, I guess, pick your version of this thing, right?
Yeah.
How do you handle this then? How do you handle being used as this enemy of the right and this thing that's happening on the right? Because it feels like it's going to take a lot of therapy for a whole lot of people to get there on this, or we just never will.
I mean, the public health workforce is in deep trouble, right? Like, sort of, it was not in good shape due to government cuts before the pandemic, and then the pandemic made it a lot worse. And
yeah.
It's kind of, even before the party politicization of public health, it was just kind of a case of, it's not raining, so I'll throw away my umbrella.
Right.
It's like, well, there will come a day when it will rain and you will not have an umbrella, right?
Right.
It's that simple, right? If you stop doing vaccination campaigns, you will get outbreaks. Just like if you stop looking at septic tanks, you will get outbreaks.
Yeah, right.
If you stop inspecting lettuce, you will get outbreaks, right? Like,
right.
We didn't have to worry about food poisoning when we had more inspections, and we've been essentially starving the food inspection system.
Right.
So there's a lot of this public health that when it's working, you don't see it. And that's great. I don't want to think about the wiring of my home, but I will think about it to the extent that my house doesn't catch fire.
Right. And it's too late when the house catches fire.
Yeah.
And it feels like things are a little bit on fire right now. I have sort of stopped asking people on the show, certainly since you've been on, what can we do to fix this thing in the future? Because I think that's actually too far away. What can we do now to sort of stop the house from burning?
So the good news on the very narrow point of vaccines is that the vaccines Trump is recommending don't exist, and they won't exist for years, as you said. So, keep going and getting the vaccines that you ought to. The germ theory of disease is pretty well proven. Vaccines are an amazing, they're practically the only technology humanity's come up with of anything like that level of power that has no downside.
Yeah.
Like electricity, you can point to downside. We're in the middle of a heat wave.
Sure.
Nuclear fission. Oh, you can definitely point to the downsides of that one.
Right.
Vaccines? A lot of people feel blue for a day and then they don't get measles. Fantastic.
Right.
But I think this also, this is a much bigger authoritarian project, and authoritarian projects don't like science. I mean, they often like technology, right? That's a through line that authoritarians like rockets and Death Stars and so forth. But authoritarian projects don't like scientists, because scientists will come out and say the data doesn't support what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, they're both morally but also functionally not being scientists if they're too good at being toadies, right?
Right.
That's why Stalin's scientists don't have a great reputation.
Right.
And I think you have to accept this, that if you have two parties where there's a basic recognition that evidence-based policymaking is a good thing, then you should figure out how to engage in evidence-based bipartisan conversations. If one party's not thinking that way, that's a much bigger political problem, and you need to start by recognizing it.
So then is the answer then start with recognizing it and just backing up the evidence-based science here at every turn and just sort of having these debunking fights over and over? Is that, it's exhausting, but yeah.
I'd also say it's making it more of a wedge issue, right? So when my students were glum, sort of around about April, I said the most interesting thing in American politics right now is the Democratic Party. Because in the logic of a two-party system, especially one where the incumbent party is profoundly underwater, the question is going to be, what do Democrats do when they have 2 years to harry and attempt to block Trump administration initiatives? How much of a priority is it going to be to haul RFK Jr. and his people up to the Hill and make them explain what they're doing and investigate conflicts of interest? Because there's plenty of other people who could be hauled to the Hill and made to explain themselves.
Right.
Right. And part of it is who's better television, right? Would you rather grill RFK Jr. or Pete Hegseth? But it's also sending very, very clear messages, and it's raising the profile of issues. So if Republican-leaning, conservative parents who want the best for their kids think that RFK Jr. is trying to give, take your picks, trying to make sure that the kids will be infertile due to inflamed testicles, that's not a great look.
Right. Right. And I guess we'll have to see what happens then after the midterms, if Democrats have the ability in the House and maybe the Senate to do some of those things, and maybe health becomes front and center in a way that it hasn't been the last couple of years, because it's just taken a backseat to the rest of it. So
I think there's a sense in which it's everything, right? Like when I talk to people who work in environment or defense or foreign policy, like they all kind of have the same experience, which is why on one hand it's simplifying because it's the logic of team sports practically.
Right.
There's only two teams on the field.
Right.
But on the other hand, it does mean that sort of there's a lot of opportunity, and this is, I guess, the happy ending, to pressure the out party, in this case, the Democrats. And then when the Republicans are heading into the end of a chaotic lame duck presidency, there's going to be a lot of opportunities on that side to start thinking about for example, what is the electoral logic of getting rid of MAHA and appealing to reasonable parents?
Right. So there's daylight here. There's wiggle room. It's just not here yet.
Not here yet.
All right. Well, Dr. Scott Greer, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I always appreciate it. It's always enlightening and a little calming, to be honest. Despite the stuff that we talk about, it is calming to have you on the show. So thank you for being here.
Just don't take my virology too seriously. You have to both know it, and then you have to be able to make it sound comprehensible. And virology and immunology are right up there with particle physics. Like, common sense died.
I will remain willfully epidemiologically naive. How's that? Yeah.
Perfect.
I want to thank Scott again for coming on the show. You can find a link to all of his great work at the University of Michigan. And that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you find your podcasts. You have just 6 days left to get in on that Make It Make Sense anniversary sale price of $5 a month or $50 a year for the Make It Make Sense Substack. You can lock in that founding price until August 20th, until the price goes up to $7 a month or $70 a year. That gets you access to the entire backlog of every single podcast and every single interview. That gives you access to the weekly original reporting, to things you've got from civics class, too long tuned out, and the occasional Make It Make Nonsense. That is something in your inbox, in your feed, 6 days a week at least. And as always, you can share the show on social media. You can tag me at Grant Hermes on Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.